Hey, how you doing? Justin here. Today we're going to be talking about the spacing effect, which is a technique you can use to memorize pretty much anything, but we're going to be specifically talking about in relation to learning songs and learning licks on the guitar. Memorizing stuff is really important. You don't want to be having to always rely on a songbook or a page of licks or scale diagrams or whatever. You really need to get that stuff internalized so you can access it in the moment that you really need it. Learning and revising things over a gradually increasing time frame is much more effective than trying to learn things in one time block. This so-called spacing effect has been recognized since the late 19th century when Ebbinghaus first wrote about it, and has turned into one of the most consistently repeatable concepts born out of experimental psychology. It even has its own Wikipedia page. This is solid science. I'll add some links over on the website if you want to dig a little deeper into this whole concept after the lesson. So the point of this lesson is to teach you how to use the science to help you remember songs and licks. I guarantee you it works. I first learned about this idea in 1995 when I was studying at the Tasmanian Conservatorium of Music. I learned 20 or 30 pieces for my final recital, and I can still remember them today because I applied these principles. So first thing is, you always want to make sure that you practice in short, concise blocks, usually around 5 minutes long. There's a few reasons for this, mostly because people can't fully focus for longer than 5 minutes. Secondly, if you're trying to learn a whole bunch of things, you don't want to work on them for too long. Thirdly, because it'll help you space them out if you're doing short blocks. One thing to note though, when you're designing a practice schedule, is to try and leave a little gap between each one of your practice blocks. So if you're going to practice for 5 minutes, leave a 1 minute gap before you start your next 5 minute block. It'll really help consolidate the information, give your brain a chance to kind of digest it. You don't want to go straight from one thing right into another thing, right into another thing. So little 5 minute blocks when you practice, and leave a little 1 minute gap in between each of the blocks. Try and just have a cup of tea, look out the window, stand up. Exercise is always a good thing to do as well. Just a little reset before you hit your next practice block. From my experience teaching for over 30 years now, it is much more effective to do 6 5-minute practice blocks during a week than it would be to do one hour practice block. So you save yourself half the time. Now, some people, it might feel a little counterintuitive, like after the 5 minutes they don't want to stop, they want to keep going because they haven't finished. But I would encourage you to explore this idea of just doing little 5-minute blocks. Even if you're not done or you feel like you could go further, just stop, leave it, go on to the next day. Later in the same day would also work as long as they're broken up, but my recommendation would be for people to practice 6 days a week for a shorter period of time than to try and do all of your practice crammed into one day or into a couple of practice sessions. An interesting analogy I can use to help you understand the spacing effect is the idea of RAM and hard drive space. So when you very first learn something, it goes into your RAM, the short-term memory. And after a period of time, it'll disappear off into the long-term storage, the hard drive. Now, when you revisit it again, your brain goes, oh, we need that bit of information. Where was it? And it brings it back into the RAM. After a few revisits where it's gone to the long-term memory and back to RAM, it creates its kind of own space in the RAM where it can live there permanently. This is where the analogy falls apart a little bit. It's just like a part of the hard drive that's more easily accessible than the long-term storage kind of things. There have been some studies that show that leaving things for longer than 4 days becomes very much like learning it again for the first time. So particularly in the initial stages, you don't want to wait longer than 3 days maybe before you revise something. So ideally, you learn it the first day, then you'll revise it the next day, then maybe leave a gap day and then revise it again. That's where you're starting the process of elongating the recalls, which is what will put things into this permanent RAM. So you'll never be able to forget stuff even if you wanted to. So to get that song, lick or scale into your permanent memory, you need to gradually increase the amount of time between revisiting the information. That's the key thing. You want to make sure that you got it right first, okay? So real slow, careful practice, learning the song or the scale and making sure you got it exactly right. If it's a song, I'd recommend trying to get it up to kind of performance level. Then once you got it, you want to leave it for a whole week without looking at it at all and then revise it. Then leave it for 2 weeks, revise it. Then a month, revise it. Then 3 months, revise it, 6 months, and then a year. Now, it might seem a little bit crazy, but it really works. After you've done that whole year without looking at something and then revised it, you'll probably struggle to forget it even if you wanted to. I promise you, this stuff works. It's incredible how much stuff I can remember from the days when I was using this really consistently, when I was having to learn material that I was reciting. I also used it for all of the concerts and tours I did with Katie Mellower 15 years ago. All of those things where I really had to remember the stuff, it's in there. I can't forget it if I wanted to. It gets a bit dusty, but I'll talk about that something else first here, which is how you recall the information. So what's really important is you dig around to try and drag it out from your memory without using any sheet music or visual cues. You might need to. And using some is okay, but you've got to really try to dig it out first, because it's the digging out of it that drags it out from the long-term memory and puts it back in the RAM. So you've learned your song. You got it in your memory, you're confident with it, you leave it for a whole week. When you revise it, you don't listen to the song, you don't try and rework it out, you don't use a tab or a sheet music or whatever notes. You just sit and you try and drag it out from memory. That's really important. You might find there's some little bits that aren't quite coming out, so you might need to revise it a little bit, and that's okay. But it should, if you need to revise it, you grab out your sheet music, you have a look and go, oh, it's that chord, of course. And then you go back to trying to dig it out. What you'll usually find is there'll be just one little bit where you think it's like, oh, what's that next part? And you can't remember it, and just keep running up to it, if you like. That's how I kind of think of it. I start from the beginning, I get up to it, and there's be like, wow, what's that next section? If I have several goes at it and I can't remember, I might revise the tab very quickly, go, oh, it's that chord, of course it is. And then I'll be able to go a significant distance further on through the song before I might need another cue. So what I usually find is in that first week, it's kind of okay. I might need a little bit of revision, but not much. The 2-week one is usually better, but then leaving it for 1 month, I might need a little bit further revision. I just have to look at it again quickly. Then definitely for 3 months or 6 months, I might need a little tweak of that information, and that's okay. But do try your hardest not to use any reference material, any tabs or anything. If you can, I think it's a really good idea to hand write sheet music for things that you want to learn yourself. I find that if I've done that I can close my eyes and kind of imagine what it looks like to some extent. I don't have great visual recall. That's a subject for another time, but definitely the process of writing it out seems to help with recalling that information. Another really fascinating part of this time spacing is that it gives your brain a chance to digest the music more thoroughly than if you try to learn it in one block. Again, there's tons of studies on this, but what you'll find is, say, you go to learn a scale. If you spend 1 hour learning a scale up and down, after an hour, you should be able to play the scale pretty confidently up and down. If you went for the 5 minutes a day every day for a week, you'd actually have done less practice. But what you'll find is that you can actually practically use the scale better. Your brain digests the scale in a way that you'd be able to play it up and down, inside out, jumble up the notes better. Whereas if you'd just done that 1 hour practice block playing the scale up and down, you'd probably find it a struggle to be able to jumble the notes up or play it any other way than straight up and down. This also works with things like music theory. If you're doing short blocks of music theory study rather than trying to cram it all at once, your brain will digest it and make further connections that you wouldn't have had a chance to make in that one block. There's loads that goes on in our subconscious after we've learned stuff. We don't even realize that our brains are doing anything, but it's sorting out the information, it's cataloging it, it's making connections between different things we've learned. It's a really, really big deal. And related to that is sleep. Sleep is crucial to the way we remember things. So making sure you get a good night's sleep after a heavy practice session is really, really going to help your attention and your ability to absorb the information. If you're tired all the time, your brain's not going to be learning new stuff very well. So make sure you figure out a nice way to get a good night's sleep. I'm not going to go into sleeping habits for you. There's plenty of information around on the internet about that. But if you're struggling with your sleep, it's definitely something that you want to address. One very interesting part of using the spacing effect for language learning, for example, blues licks, which is part of a blues language, is that the actual learning often takes a little longer, but the retention is much, much better. Now, actually, what you want when you're learning language is retention. You don't want to have to look at a book or a phrase book or a page of licks when you're doing a solo, right? That doesn't make any sense. What you want is to be able to access the information, the licks, instantly, in the moment, without having to think about it. So even though the initial learning phase might take a little longer, having that retention stronger is exactly what you want, particularly for learning licks, phrases, if you're into blues or jazz, and improvising. It really, really is an important part of the journey. So another benefit of using the spacing effect is that it generates more retrieval cues. Now, we tend to recall things easiest when we're in a similar environment to the one that we learned it in. Now, this is interesting, particularly for musicians and performers. A lot of people find that they struggle to recall things on stage that they were doing fine in the bedroom. Now, some of that is to do with this idea of retrieval cues. So a nice way of getting around that one when you're practicing is to imagine yourself in the environment where you're going to actually use this stuff. So trying to put yourself in a picture like, oh yeah, I'm on stage, I'm playing this thing, I'm doing it this way. That can be really helpful. But you'll find using the spacing effect helps it anyway, because even if you're practicing the same way at the same time in the same place at home, you're always doing your practice in that way, having a slightly different life experience broadens the retrieval cues, and therefore it actually makes it easier to recall the information on stage. So again, if you've done all in one practice block, you'll have one retrieval cue. When you've practiced loads of different times over loads of different, slightly different life experiences that you have each day, it actually broadens the retrieval cue factor, and you'll find it easier to recall in other circumstances as well. I know some of this stuff seems a little bit far-fetched, but there is solid science behind all of these things that I'm talking about with you today. I just got a couple more little golden nuggets for you before I leave you to get on with your practice. The first thing I want to talk about is scheduled revision. It's what I use when I want to actually memorize something. I learn loads of songs, I learn loads of licks, and I learn loads of musical things. Most of it I don't have to remember. I couldn't. I don't have enough brain power to remember everything that I'm teaching you, especially every song. But the ones that I want to actually remember, I put into a scheduled revision calendar that I have in my diary. So when I learned Satch Boogie, say, the little riff from that, I really wanted to make sure I remember that one. It's a good kind of party trick song. So I learned it, I did the video lesson for it, and then I scheduled it to learn it or revise it a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later. I'm doing that. I think I'm due to revise it again in a couple of months, but I have it in a little program. I just use the calendar on my Mac, and then it just pops up, reminds me, hey, you got to practice this today. Okay, it's a really, really effective way of doing it. You could do it in a paper book as well, which is actually what I did back in the day when I was studying the classical stuff. I just used to write in my diary when I had to practice it again. So either one, but using some sort of scheduled revision is going to really help you for all of the stuff that you really want to put into permanent memory. So one last thing before I just do a little recap. This is a beautiful little thing from science that you might like to try using, and it's called semantic priming. Now, the idea here is that when you're learning new information, if it's related to something that you've learned before, it's a lot easier to remember. So anytime you're trying to learn a new thing, see if before you start learning it, if you can find something that it's related to, so that you've got somewhere to kind of put the information. You've got a folder on your hard drive where you can put that new information straight away, rather than it just being scattered about the place. So anytime I'm learning a new lick, let's say I'm learning a blues lick, I'll practice a few other related blues licks first, just to put my brain in that kind of a zone. Often if I'm learning a new song, I might play a similar song, a song by the same artist or that uses a similar technique before, just to give my brain some sort of cue that, oh, this new thing that you're going to learn, this belongs here. That's where we should put this new information. It does seem to help with the recall if you can use a bit of semantic priming. So to summarize, I've got 6 points for you. Point 1, always try to spread out your learning and don't try and learn anything in one practice block. Secondly, try and make the practice blocks not longer than 5 minutes so that you can give it your full attention. Point 3, leave a short gap between every practice block. Point 4, always try and build on prior knowledge. That's the semantic priming. Point 5, to memorize something permanently, use the spacing effect to gradually increase the time between revising the information. And lastly, try to get a good night's sleep. It'll help you with all your learning and probably just make your life feel a whole lot nicer as well. I really hope that you enjoyed this lesson. Let me know if you got any questions in the comments. I'll try and address them. Like I mentioned before, there's loads more information and links over on the website. There'll be a link in the description if you're over on YouTube. If you're already on the website, it'll all be down below. So do go and check that out. Have yourselves a fantastic day, and I'll see you for more lessons very soon. You take care. Bye-bye.